I'm delighted to be back at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I spent a wonderful time as a public policy scholar. It's great to see many friends. It's great to see Hala Esfandiari again. Thank you for the invitation. The Middle East Studies Department of the Woodrow Wilson Center consistently puts together the best Middle East programs in town, and so I hope you'll agree with me that that first session was really illuminating. So let me start by just saying that we're talking about a very timely topic here, of course, but when haven't we been talking about timely topics when we're talking about today's Middle East? It reminds me a bit of what Vladimir Ilyich Lenin once said, where he said that sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and then suddenly weeks pass and decades happen. And it certainly, does feel that way, that decades have been happening in the past just weeks, months, and years. And since I've opened the floodgates with quoting one Marxist, allow me to quote another. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist and writer, writing of a different time in a different era, of course. But I think it's a great framing quote when we think about today's Middle East and today's Gulf and today's Iran-GCC ties. He said, "The old is dying and the new has not yet been born. And in the interregnum, there are dangerous morbidities." I really feel like we're in this transitional moment in the region where there are these dangerous morbidities. And what I'd like to do also is maybe turn to our panelists to see if some of these dangerous morbidities can be turned into unique opportunities as well in this transitional moment. And so, the headlines has certainly been of Iran-Saudi proxy war, Iran-Saudi confrontation, and I thought the previous panel handled that very well. But let's remember what this is not, this period. This is, while the headline might be of Iran-Saudi confrontation, this is not the late 1980s or the mid-1980s when several GCC states were funding Saddam Hussein and a full-blown war between Iran and Iraq was convulsing the Persian Gulf region. Let's also note that this is not even 2011, when there was a real serious war of words between the GCC states and Iran, but particularly, there was a Gulf foreign minister, he was not quoted by name, quoted in Al Hayat newspaper, saying we are ready to go to war with Iran to protect Bahrain. So let's remember that we're not even in 2011. We're also not in the 1997 through roughly 2002, 2003 period, which was kind of the height of the GCC-Iran rapprochement, post-Rafsanjani, early Khatami. I remember I was in Tehran when Crown Prince Abdullah made his landmark visit to Tehran for the Organization of Islamic Conference Summit. And what was very striking about that is members of the Saudi delegation, it snowed during that summit, and there were members of the Saudi delegation who didn't even know that it snowed in Tehran. And so these two, countries, powers in the Persian Gulf region really distant from each other over the past 20 years. While there may have been some high-level interactions, there haven't been the kind of diplomatic, academic, and cultural interactions that one might expect of these two countries. But we're certainly not where we were in some of those really dark periods. And then just let me relay to you two conversations I had. One was with a senior Saudi official just last week. And this is someone who, engages at the very highest level, has met the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has met Iranian presidents. And his view, which kind of corroborates, David's view, is that, we've tried. This is his view, and I'm speaking in his voice. We've tried. We've reached out to presidents. We've reached out to foreign ministers. And we have these conversations, and then there's no follow-up. Or promises are made and they're not delivered, on those promises. And his view, again, this is his view, is that the people that matter in the political system in Iran, and his view is that it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, don't really want to talk to us anyway. And so he, the senior official who has been to Tehran several times, did feel a great deal of mistrust. And also, it reminded me of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with an Iranian official who was kind of conveying the same spirit. We've tried. We've reached out to them. They don't want to talk to us. So both sides are saying we're trying, and yet somehow it's not working. To the specific case of the Javad Zarif potential visit, the way it was described to me by the senior Saudi official was that the foreign minister of Iran, again, take it for what it is, this is one official, but the foreign minister of Iran wanted a guarantee that he could see King Abdullah during that visit, and they weren't willing to provide him with that guarantee. And therefore the visit has still not taken place. So we have an excellent we have an excellent two speakers here, and I'll introduce each of them before they speak. Let me first turn to Bijan Khajehpour. Bijan has been a leading voice on Iran's economy, on regional economies, on oil and gas issues, on economic integration issues, and if there's anybody who can figure out how to change the dangerous morbidities into unique opportunities, I think Bijan might be the one. So let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and I'm also grateful to Hale and the whole team here in the Wilson Center for the invitation and for the event. I'm learning a lot, and I'm happy that Abdullah provided the first GCC-Iran cooperation this morning by giving you a preview of some of my energy-related discussions that I have. I will share that with you in a minute. I want to use this quote from Afshin, which I think is very, very fitting. This sort of the old has died and the new hasn't been born as yet. Maybe one of our tasks is to identify what this new is or could be, and I will try that during my presentation. Let me start with some introductory remarks. First of all, because the topic was given this way, my presentation assumes that there will be a comprehensive deal. Obviously, don't accuse me of being too optimistic at the end of it. Well, the topic is that, well, assume there is a deal, what will happen? Second assumption is the process of sanctions relief is going to take long. It's not going to happen overnight or over a couple of weeks or a couple of months. It will be at least a couple of years. So we have to, if we are serious, we have to look at some short-term prospects and some medium-term prospects, and that is what I will try to do in my outlook. And then I have identified 4 areas where I think there will be convergence or divergence in the field of economic activity and economic development. One is the energy sector. For me, that's the most important part. I will spend most of my time on the energy sector, and just to give you the preview, I think the new that hasn't been born or but could be born is energy interrelationship in our region. I will explain why. Regional trade and cross-border investments is the other area. There will also be competition, and I think we heard it in the first panel as well, this whole feeling that there is a competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, both in the field of ideology and sort of leadership in the Islamic world, but also in the field of economy and technology. They look at each other. When they make plans, they look at each other's capacities and plans, and it's important to understand that competition is there, and it's not unique to Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's also between Iran and Turkey and a lot of other nations. And finally, there will definitely be, once there is a lifting of sanctions, there will be competition in our region for international investment, for foreign direct investment, and we have to understand the dynamics of that. I said that I will spend a lot of time on energy, and in fact, I will start with some facts, because also this morning we heard this whole notion of North American shale revolution and the Middle East is not that important anymore. Well, fortunately, last week BP published the latest annual statistical review, and these are the figures for our region. I'm not going to go into every detail, but I can tell you the Middle East still holds 48% of the world's oil reserves, and roughly the same amount of gas reserves. In terms of oil production, actual production of global production is about 32% in our region. This is just the Persian Gulf region. It doesn't include the larger Middle East. In gas, as you see, there is a mismatch between actual reserve and actual production, and the main reason is that Iran is actually producing way below its potential, obviously partly because of the sanctions over the past decade. Well, what's interesting is that, first of all, according to BP, for the second year in a row, Iran has the largest gas reserves in the world. Iran alone, and the field that was referred to by Abdullah, the Iranian South Pars, Qatari North Dome that are connected to each other, is the largest gas field in the world. So it's important, I highlight that because you will see gas is the element of connectivity in the future of our region. You will see that. Whoever wants these figures, I'm happy to share them with you. They are all from the latest BP statistical review, which was published last week. But let's look at some other important facts, and this is the one is gas consumption. And here, the very interesting fact is that gas consumption is actually, these are the countries. Unfortunately, there were not individual figures for Oman or Bahrain, so I could only include these 5 countries. But you can see how annual gas consumption is growing, and how over the past 3 years, and these are exactly the 3 years that Iran has had the subsidy reforms in Iran, Iran's gas consumption has not grown, so Iran's subsidy reforms and price corrections have actually contained gas consumption in the country. But look at where Saudi is going. This is gas consumption in Saudi Arabia. Over the past 3-4 years, a growth of about 25 to 30%. And if you project that into the future, you're going to have difficulties managing this energy consumption. And I will come back with other figures. Obviously, looking at gas is one thing because, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, about half of the electricity production in Saudi Arabia is being fueled with liquid fuels, not with gas, because they don't have enough gas. So it's better to look at what the economists call primary energy consumption. And this is the picture for primary energy consumption. Again, look at the figures of Saudi Arabia. This is all the energy that Saudi Arabia is consuming. And essentially, look at these 2 figures. Iran has 75 million population, Saudi Arabia 27 million, according to the latest figures, almost the same energy consumption. And when you look at it on in per capita situation, this is per capita in kilogram of oil equivalent per year. Look at the scary figure. I've included Turkey to have a benchmark, not a Western country with high energy efficiency, Turkey, a regional peer. Look where we are. Iran, almost double of Turkey. But look at the others. Saudi, 4 times that of Turkey. UAE, scary. Qatar, you can explain some of Qatar's energy consumption. It's a low population, but high level of industrialization, hence a higher per capita energy consumption. But why am I mentioning all of this is that essentially, when you project this region into the future and say, we want to industrialize, and all of them say we want to industrialize, all of them say we want to invest in gas-based industries and oil-based industries, we want to create value add and export petroleum products rather than crude oil and gas, well, you will have to have the energy for it. And that is why, essentially, from an energy point of view, this whole region needs the gas that it has. Right now, one of the ironies of the GCC, with all due respect to GCC, is that Qatar is exporting LNG to world markets, and UAE and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia are importing LNG from world markets. And the ships cross each other in the Strait of Hormuz. That is how far GCC has come with energy and economic integration. And this is one of the sad stories of our region, that the potential is there, but it is not being utilized. So what is the outlook for our region? With these types of resources, the resources are there. They are not threatened. The Persian Gulf's significance for the oil energy equation is not threatened by the North American shale revolution. This is important to understand. The North American shale revolution is shifting trade patterns, is shifting export routes, but it's not reducing the Persian Gulf's significance on international oil markets, because there are oil and gas markets, because there are enough energy markets that are growing. Asian markets and so on. So it's important to understand. So where are we going? First of all of these countries have already started and will continue to do so to invest more and more in value-add products. When you look at their future strategies, projections, they all say we are going to be major exporters of petroleum products. And to be fair to them, all of them are investing in it. The industrialization itself, when you start building all these petrochemical plants and refineries and other industrial plants, you obviously need the infrastructure and the energy. Again, here, the energy factor is important. So it's not just the resource that is there, you also have to have the capacity to produce energy. So, and the big missing element, with the exception of Iran and Qatar, in all these countries is gas. They need gas. Otherwise, similar to what Saudi Arabia is doing right now, if you use your liquids, your crude oil and your petroleum products to generate energy, you are underutilizing your potential. This is important to understand. Gas has the highest energy efficiency for power generation and other issues. So the region as a whole needs Iran's gas potential, also Qatar's gas potential. But Qatar's gas potential, at least for the time being, is more or less dedicated. Qatar has focused on LNG production, has become the capital of LNG production in the world, and is exporting LNG. It may change, the patterns may change, again, because of North American shale gas revolution and other facts, also the Australian gas production. If it would have not been for the Fukushima event in Japan, there may have been a completely different trade pattern even right now. But for now, Japan is buying up a lot of Qatar's LNG. But so essentially, one of the key points I want to make here today is keeping a pressure on Iran's gas sector and not allowing it to grow is to the detriment of the entire region. And then we can obviously continue the thought, well, if you keep the region underdeveloped, are you breeding terrorists because of economic injustice, because of economic underdevelopment, and so on? But I leave that to you, because mine is about the economy. And you saw the per capita energy consumptions. So energy efficiency is going to be a very big issue in this region. I mentioned that briefly. The only country that has introduced some degree of subsidy reforms is Iran, even though I am a critique of the way it was implemented, but the idea is correct. But it's not happening in the other countries, at least not at the pace that it should happen to contain this development. And to just prove that this whole gas interdependency is real, as also Abdullah mentioned, Oman has already signed to import gas from Iran. Iraq has signed a contract to import gas from Iran. Kuwait is about to sign one. And essentially, also the UAE and Saudi Arabia, in one form or the other, have to import gas or electricity. There is, unless they decide to utilize their energy sources inefficiently. So the potential, the real potential for energy connectivity and energy cooperation is in the field of gas or electricity exchanges in the region. So I've given you the regional picture, the most significant element being energy. Let's now have a look at Iran. As I said, there will be, assuming there is a comprehensive agreement, and assuming that there will be two waves of impact. One is the short-term impact, just look at the next year, and one is the medium-term impact, look at the next 2-3 years. These are the areas that I think should be highlighted. Economy, the Iranian economy is going to benefit emotionally and practically, and also because of the release of Iranian funds, feasibility of transactions, the Iranian economy is going to grow. So let's focus on the short term first. In terms of imports, as soon as the sanctions are lifted, Iran will have a huge gap to fill. The sanctions of the past few years have meant that Iran could not import all the different, especially technological items that are needed. So there will be a huge sort of growth in imports. It won't be the same pattern over the next few years in the medium term, because then there will be a new balance. Iranian producers will also start producing, etc. Oil production, some analysts argue that if the sanctions are lifted and Iran goes back to the previous oil production capacities, that will create tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iraq about oil markets. It's really not that. Iran at best, in the short term, in the next year, will go back to a production level of 4 million barrels a day. That was the production level roughly before the latest wave of sanctions. That means about 400,000 to 500,000 barrels a day more than it's producing now, and also about 500,000 barrels a day more in exports. There is almost no day in international world markets where you don't have an event, whether it's in Nigeria or Iraq or Sudan or other places, Libya, that 500,000 barrels are not taken off the market. So 500,000 barrels a day are not going to create a major hiccup or the competition, major rivalry between Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia. It's not going to do that. Even in the medium term, I will show you it's not happening. The real growth in Iran in the next 2-3 years is gas, and I will show you the figures. Iran is going to dramatically increase its gas production capacity and real production. And I'm telling you based on actual projects. It's not based on official figures and projections. These are actual projects that are almost finished and will be finished over the next couple of years. And if I were the other players in the region, I would be relieved. I would say, well, great, there is excess gas potential that we could actually import, or we could import in the form of electricity. Non-oil exports, initially there will be marginal growth, and the main focus will be on regional markets. But in the medium term, there will be a larger emphasis or greater emphasis in Iran on non-oil exports. This is really the Iranian strategy, the sort of export-led growth strategy that Iran is following. Investments, Iran will, in the short term, but also in the medium term, need a lot of investments, both in terms of actual foreign direct investment, but also in terms of financing activities and so on. And for me, this is an opportunity for all the GCC players to actually invest in Iran. And we know the overall tendency since 9/11 that, these sovereign wealth funds in the region actually try to remain in their own region and invest in their own region. And here is a country that could potentially offer some investment opportunities. So these are the sort of projection of what will happen in Iran if there is a comprehensive agreement. But let's look at, I told you, I share with you the figures. This is the current picture of the Iranian oil and gas sector. As I said, oil production roughly 3.6 million barrels a day. These are also BP figures, and about 1.5 million barrels a day of oil exports. And this is the gas situation. Our gas exports are very marginal. Most of the gas is being consumed domestically. But when you go into the actual dimensions of how this gas is being used, obviously some of it is being exported in the form of gas-based industries, cement and petrochemicals and other gas-based industries. So it's important to understand that if we say Iran is not exporting gas, it doesn't mean that it's wasting all its energy. No, it's actually adding value and exporting gas in other forms. But if you project this into the next 2 years, 2016 roughly, so our medium-term perspective, sorry, this was not meant. First of all, oil production will grow marginally in essence, and partly because obviously the cycles are longer. So even if Iran starts a number of ambitious projects to increase oil production, it is going to take 3, 4, 5 years till they materialize. But even with that, when you look at all the refinery and mini refinery projects that Iran is planning right now and issuing licenses, a lot of this additional production will actually be used domestically to produce petroleum products. So Iran's additional crude oil potential is not going to, again, put pressure on the crude oil markets. This is important to understand. Iran, on a crude oil level, is not going to compete with the other players. On a petroleum product level, Iran is going to compete with others, petrochemicals and petroleum. This is important. But the real story is gas. And this jump from here to here is real. It is happening. Some projects are almost finished. This is all South Pars, different South Pars projects. The minister himself even talked about 1,000 million cubic meters by 2016. I have reduced it based on my figures, and I think this is more realistic. But even this, look at the potential for gas exports in 2016. And as I said, this can be exported in the form of gas. It can be exported in the form of gas-based products. It can be exported in the form of electricity and other forms. It's important that the potential will be there. How it is utilized obviously depends on so many other issues, including how these different deals with Oman and Kuwait and Pakistan. There is even the talk about a second gas deal with Iraq. So you see the potential is already translating into activity. To understand what's happening in Iran and how the Iranian energy sector can play a role in the region, it's important to understand what has happened in the Iranian petroleum industry in the past decade, exactly in the decade that the country was under these heavy sanctions. First of all, Iran has moved from a major consumer of foreign technology and a pure exporter of oil to now being an exporter of oil, gas, and petrochemical products. This is and petroleum and petrochemical products. This is important. So Iran has sort of achieved its own goal of becoming more an exporter of added value products. Iran is also exporting petroleum industry equipment. Obviously, when you put the sanctions on Iran, you forced Iran to go and start producing some of these equipments domestically. And now some of this, it may not be the highest quality, but it is working, and there are enough markets, whether it's Venezuela or Sudan or other international markets that are actually buying these equipment. So this is important to understand. Iran has also become a hub for energy interconnectivity in the region. Iran's electricity grid is now more or less connected to every single neighbor that has land border with Iran. To some countries, Iran is actually exporting, like Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. To other countries like Turkey, there is an exchange, basically, that sometimes Iran is importing, sometimes Iran is exporting. So it's very important to understand this interconnectivity. Iran's pipeline network, which I will share with you in a minute, is connected to almost all the key neighbors. Furthermore, subsidy reforms, as I mentioned, have increased awareness about energy efficiency. I showed the figures to you, and those are BP figures. Over the last 3 years, Iran has more or less contained the growth of energy consumption, and that's mainly thanks to these subsidy reforms, because prices have changed behaviors. There is a potential for value-add projects, and when you look at the actual strategy, this is the formulation of the strategy based on this so-called document on resistance economy. Remember, I mentioned this here, I think, a few months ago. This has now become a major document, and in the oil sector, these are the objectives. And again, here you see a lot of emphasis on value add, increase exports of electricity, increase exports of petrochemicals, petroleum products, and so on. So exporting the commodities of gas-based industries, these are petrochemicals, primary, then steel, aluminum, cement, power generation. All of these are going to be the core of the Iranian strategy over the next decade. And we realize that there is a market for almost all of them. Even for the cement and the steel and the aluminum, if you want to build the infrastructures for the industrial objectives you have, you need all of these commodities. And Qatar, for example, is importing Iranian cement right now. It's one of the largest importers of Iranian cement. I always say that the football stadiums for Qatar 2022 are being built with Iranian cement. So it's important to understand this is where the country is going. And this is just to share the map with you. These are existing pipelines and planned pipelines. And you see the connectivity points with Turkmenistan, with Azerbaijan, with Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, Iraq, Oman, planned that to Kuwait. There is even an unused pipeline to the UAE. It's a disputed one, but it is there. So you can see even this connection to Pakistan, even though it's uncertain whether it will ever realize. But the connectivity is there. They're even planning a loop system so that they can actually connect, really function as a hub and fill gaps if there are gaps in the region. This is important to understand. It's not just on paper, it's happening. These pipelines are being built and contracts are being negotiated and signed. And you could draw a similar map for interconnectivity of grids. So what does this all mean for the Persian Gulf region? First of all, as I said, the additional oil production in Iran over the next 2-3 years is not going to be an issue. It's not going to create a headache for any of the strategists. Some people will exaggerate it because they like exaggerating tensions between these countries, but it won't talk to an oil strategist and they will not be upset about 500,000 barrels more here and there. But Iran, the gas and electricity potential of Iran could actually drive economic and industrial development in this region. I showed you it's needed. If they don't buy it from Iran, they will have to buy it from Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, they have to buy it. And there is no doubt about that. Iranian projects will also be an opportunity for Arab investors in the country. We need financing, we need foreign direct investment, and so on. It's important. And I know that GCC investors are looking for opportunities. It's just the political atmosphere has to be right. And there are many, many opportunities for cross-border opportunities. Thank you. Oman provides an example. The gas deal for Oman is that Iranian gas goes to Oman, converted into LNG, and exported to international markets. Everyone is winning. So the economic and energy interdependency could actually become a platform for cooperation. And as I said, this may be that new that hasn't been born as yet. Obviously, there are areas of competition very quickly. Petroleum products. There will be competition. Iran, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they're all major producers of petroleum products. And between Iran and Qatar, petrochemical products. There will be competition. And it's important to understand that the global market is moving in that direction. There was a very, very good FT article on this, that within the next 5 years, the competition in the global market won't be about crude oil, it will be about petroleum products. And it's shifting. The Middle East is also following that pattern. There will be competition for investments, foreign direct investment. Obviously, all of these markets need technology, need investment. And as I said, Tehran does view the sort of economic and technological competition between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey as an area of competition. They are trying to beat the other one on petrochemical industry, petroleum product industry, and so on. I think I've talked about most of these things. There is obviously a lot of potential for cross-border investment. I just want to mention one thing, if you allow me. The biggest loser of all of this, if there is a comprehensive deal and there is more regional trade, will be Dubai initially. Because Dubai right now is the main re-exporter to Iran. The Iran-Dubai trade of about between $11 to $16 billion over the past few years. These were not UAE products going to Iran. These were other products going to Iran. And if Iran can buy directly, Dubai will suffer initially. But in the medium run, I've written about this, Dubai actually could turn this around and become a hub for Iranian exports to world markets because they have the infrastructure, they have the ports and so on. So let me conclude. In the short run, as I said, Iran's additional oil production will be marginal and it won't make a big difference. It won't become a headache. The main area of competition, petroleum products, petrochemicals, but the main area of interest for everyone should be Iran's gas production and how this gas gets utilized in the region, because this is also what Iran wants. Iran's strategy is more and more energy interconnectivity with immediate neighbors based on gas pipelines or electricity connectivity. And I really believe if we manage, and this is the big if we manage to develop a win-win mentality in our region, nothing can beat the win-win-win reality of energy interconnectivity in our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bijan. I thought you would be able to turn the dangerous morbidities into a unique opportunity. Now, I won't ask you to do the same, Marina, particularly since you're talking about Iraq. Yeah. But it's great to introduce Marina Attaway. Many of you know her. She needs no introduction. She's been working on Middle East issues, Islamist movements, democracy issues in the region, and writing with great sensitivity and skill. And I'll turn it over to you now, Marina.
Thank you very much. It's very tempting to move directly into the question and answer questions concerning his presentation, given how interesting it was. And I have many questions for you. But let me start by doing what I'm supposed to be doing, which is talking about Iraq, and particularly talking about the implication of a deal with Iran, the nuclear agreement with Iran for Iraq. And the first question that needs to be addressed is, which Iraq are we talking about? Because if we think of Iraq as a unitary state with its capital in Baghdad, one country and under one government, essentially, I think the implications of the agreement would be rather positive. Since 2003, Iraq has been suffering from being totally isolated, and I would say ostracized more than just isolated, from the Gulf countries. In other words, there is no trust between the Gulf states and, in general, other Arab countries and Iraq. Relations have been very, very cool. There is very little exchange, which has essentially forced Iraq closer to Iran on one hand, but also it has deprived it of a lot of potential for trade, for arrangements with other countries. So that essentially it's a country that's only fulfilling, if you want, half of its potential in terms of foreign relations. So you'd say it would be very positive for Iraq to have a situation in which they can have they can renew their relationship with the Gulf countries. This is the fairy tale. Because essentially that country, Iraq is a unitary country, and I'm going to stick my neck out, does not exist at this point. I think that country has ceased to exist in the last few weeks. Whether or not it can be put together again, I very much doubt it that it can be put together under the same system of governance that it had before. I don't know if it can be put together in any other form. What is certainly is that right now it does not exist. So that if we want to look at the implications of an agreement, of an Iranian nuclear agreement, I think we really need to look at what are becoming more and more clear are the component parts of Iraq. The problem is that, we started with Gramsci. We might as well stay with Gramsci, that in the case of Iraq, we are really in a situation where the old is dead and the new has not been born. Because I think, and the old that's dead is Iraq as the country the United States envisaged, if you want, as the country that it was under Saddam Hussein, and the country, the U.S. nation-building project, you remember when we still talked about nation-building, was trying to develop. And the new is very uncertain because there is a present reality, which is essentially of a country which is quite divided, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And where that is going to go, I'm no prophet, and I really cannot answer the question. So before we can look at the potential impact of an agreement, we really need to look at what Iraq is right now. And Iraq essentially is three regions that are really very, very loosely connected to each other. And there is a government in Baghdad, of course. The United States is trying to put pressure on Iraqi politicians to make this government in Baghdad into an inclusive government that represents all population groups, that represent Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds, essentially. The problem with that is that you have three population groups that have very different agendas at this problem. And I don't think that it is possible to put together a government at this point based on the results of the last election, a government where the main actors are the political parties that participated in the elections, that actually represents the entire country and with which the entire country can identify. In other words, that inclusive government that even if it was possible to speed up the process of government formation, even if there was the possibility, which I don't see right now, but even if it was the possibility of putting together another government of national unity, like the ones that was formed after the 2010 elections and did not last in reality, Maliki dismantled it pretty quickly. But even if it was possible to go back to that government, I would argue that it would not be a government sufficiently inclusive to address the issues that Iraq is facing at the present time. So what are the issues? Essentially, if you look after after ISIS or ISIL took over Mosul, essentially, in a surprisingly quick period of time, the country has become separated into three different areas. They are really under different type of political control, and most importantly, I would argue, are militarily controlled by different forces. You have the Shia part of Iraq, controlled from Baghdad, and that is where Maliki is still in power, where that is where he has mobilized the Shia militias for the defense of Baghdad, for the defense of the holy places further south, and so on. But what is happening, but that Shia core of Iraq at this point has very little influence on what happens elsewhere. And I think it will continue to have very little influence. The north part of the country, north and west, actually, I should say. In other words, the Sunni, those areas where the population is predominantly Sunni are no longer governed by from Baghdad. The cities have been taken over. They are not completely, because it's still a bit of a very, it's still spotty. But by and large, the government has pretty much lost control. And it was quite clear that ISIL is very determined to consolidate its control over those regions. If you have been following events recently, what you are seeing is that ISIL is systematically taking over the border posts with Syria and with Jordan, essentially. And the ones with Turkey have already been taken, either are in the hands of Kurdistan, and that's another story to which I'll come in a moment, or they have already been taken over. So essentially, this northern Iraq is becoming incorporated in with parts of Syria that ISIL controls. Certainly, they are not under the control of Baghdad. The military in those areas, the Iraqi armed forces, have suffered defeat after defeat. More importantly, perhaps, than the defeat after defeat, they have refused to fight, because the only way you can describe it, there have not been many pitched battles. There have been a few, but by and large, the military simply has decided not to fight in these areas. And there have been, and at this point, the United States considers that about a third of the military is not combat ready or combat prepared, whatever the term that is being used. there is not much, I would argue, that Maliki or the central government or any other government in Baghdad, I would argue, can do to reestablish control over this area. Because with the military having essentially fallen apart, except for certain elite units, the government has turned to the mobilization of Shia militias. We really don't know how many people have been mobilized that way. Some of the figures you read are grossly exaggerated. I doubt very much that Muqtada Sadr has 200,000 people. But there is no doubt that there are large numbers of Shia volunteers that have presented themselves. How well organized they are, how well armed they are, I think it's all very unclear. But what is clear is that these militias are extremely unlikely to be able to fight in the Sunni regions, right? Because they are Shia militias. And they are not going to be particularly welcomed. So that essentially the Shia militias are probably very important to hold the line in Baghdad, to hold the line south in the predominantly Shia parts of Iraq. But they are not probably going to be much help in allowing the government to reestablish control in the north part of the country. Let me talk about then the Kurdish area, and then I'll come to the implications of a possible agreement on all this. What's happening in Kurdistan is, if I can put it very simply, right now the Kurds have won. The Kurds have gotten what they wanted all along, because Kurds were able to move very quickly to take over, sort of in the wake of the collapse of the Iraqi military. They moved into those areas that they have wanted all along. The large, not only Kirkuk, not the entire Kirkuk province, but the Kirkuk city and the mostly Kurdistan inhabited part of Kirkuk province, and those parts of Nineveh province, somewhat Salahuddin and Diyala, that they have been claiming all along were there. In other words, the territory where you have a very large Kurdish population, or where the Kurdish population is the majority. There is no indication that the Kurds have gone beyond those areas that are predominantly Kurds in terms of the population. And I would argue they are extremely unlikely to do that, because by going beyond the Kurdish areas, they would create for themselves a major headache and so on. Now, these areas are so far fairly safe because ISIL has left them alone. There have been a few battles, couple of places where there have been encounter between the Peshmerga, which are the Kurdish forces, and ISIL. And I think those encounters were by mistake. The impression I have is that there is a tacit agreement of the two sides to leave each other alone, essentially. I don't think ISIL has given any sign of being interested in occupying Kurdish areas. If their goal is the caliphate, the Kurdish areas don't figure very well into this Islamic state. Yes, most Kurds are Sunnis, but they are also, it's a different population group. It's quite different. And there is no sign that the Kurds, for their part, are anxious to confront ISIL. What are the implications of this? And there are two implications. One is that for the foreseeable future, Kurdistan is another country at this point. And I'll elaborate in a moment. And the second one is that Peshmerga is extremely unlikely to help Maliki or to help the government in Baghdad to reestablish control over the north, because they have shown that they are not interested in confronting ISIL. We have no idea about what the outcome of such a confrontation would be, because there is really a lot that we don't understand about the military situation. There are probably people who understand it better than I do. But one thing that we don't understand is how strong ISIL is on the battlefront because they really took over the north part of Iraq with very little fight because they encountered no resistance from the army. We don't know how strong the Peshmerga is. They were a very remarkable guerrilla force in, way back when they were fighting against Saddam Hussein. Today's Peshmerga are not the same people, among other things. It's a new generation. I mean, it's just so that there are a lot of things that are not clear what would happen if there was a confrontation on the battleground. But the most important thing is that it's very unlikely that this confrontation will take place. Now, the Kurds are speaking very openly. Even today, Barzani and the Nechirvan Barzani, the prime minister, not the president, made a statement to the effect that, and this is not the first time he makes that statement, to the effect that the only way to keep Iraq together at this point is as a confederation of three regions, fairly loosely connected to each other. And they made innumerable statements by Kurdish officials have reiterated that they are not going to give up those parts of the lands that they claimed all along, that they will not give up Kirkuk, that will not give up the contested territory that they have now occupied. Can they maintain control of those areas? And there are two issues here. One is, can they maintain control of those areas and of the rest of Kurdistan if ISIL should decide that it wants to occupy those areas? And there we don't know, because we really don't know what is the relation, the capacity of the Peshmerga to fight. The one that is most pertinent right now, given the fact that ISIL does not seem to be inclined to fight in Kurdistan, is can they maintain control? Do they have the financial capacity to continue administering these areas, to stay there, and essentially to finance what it takes to run this new, what I would call Greater Kurdistan, but using or Greater Iraqi Kurdistan. Okay, I don't mean Greater Kurdistan in terms of including all the Kurdish areas in Iran and Turkey and Syria, but just Greater Iraqi Kurdistan. That is the old Kurdistan plus Kirkuk and the territories. And here the question, we go back to the issue of energy and on energy connectivity in a sense, because the answer to that is it depends on whether Kurdistan can continue exporting, how successful it is in controlling, in exporting its oil. Kurdistan at this point has a pipeline that goes directly to Turkey, connects to the Fish Khabur to Ceyhan pipeline. That pipeline has stayed open, contrary to the pipeline that goes from Kirkuk through Mosul and again to Fish Khabur and to Ceyhan. That pipeline has been closed since March, if I'm not completely, because of terrorist attacks. The pipeline is simply, it was being repaired, and you can imagine what's happening now to the repairs of that pipeline. Obviously, this is not happening. But the pipeline through Kurdish territory for the time being is intact. The Turkish government has decided to side with Turkey on this and is allowing independent export of Kurdish oil, which Baghdad completely opposes. And at this point, there are about 120,000 barrels of oil per day being sent to Ceyhan through the pipeline. They think that the plan is to have the amount up doubled by July, and then to go up to about 400,000 by the end of the year. But there is more to that. Then there is the fact that since they took over Kirkuk, the Kurds have announced that let me backtrack 1 second. The Kirkuk oil fields are made up of 3 different domes. One that was already being controlled by the Kurds, and that is connected to the pipeline. The other 2 were not connected to the pipeline. Just a few days ago at an oil meeting in London, the minister, the Kurdish oil minister or energy minister, I'm not quite sure what his title is, announced that now they have joined the Kurmala Dome, which is the one that's already connected to the pipeline, to one of the other two domes. And those domes in Kurdish territory are connected to each other. So that essentially, if the story is correct, and I think it is, because I don't think, keep in mind that these domes are not very far from each other, so they are short pipelines. We are not talking about thousands of miles of pipelines, essentially. Potentially, the Kurdistan can start exporting oil from Kirkuk as well. There are questions, technical questions that I don't know, that I cannot answer about. I think the pipeline has the capacity to take up to 1 million barrels per day. I'm not sure that it's quite up to it at this point. The pipeline is still new, it's still being tested to some extent, and how quickly they could ramp up the exports, it's not clear. But there is a potential, essentially, that at this point, even the oil from Kirkuk would go out through, would go out through the Kurdistan. All right, so essentially the argument here is that at this point you really have three separate countries. What would be the implication of an agreement on these three separate countries? And this becomes very complicated because it's not saying Iraq as a whole would benefit. I think the main, it would leave Iran in a very good condition in Iraq, in terms of their influence in Iraq, with an oil agreement, with a nuclear agreement, or without a nuclear agreement. I think Iran would be in a very good position because it would be the major influence in Shia Iran. In a very strange way, the United States and Iran were on the same side in Iraq. They have been for many years now, because both Iran and the United States backed Maliki. The United States, it's not saying so openly, but clearly all the statements about the necessity for an inclusive government are anti-Maliki statements because his government was all but inclusive. So the United States is turning away from Maliki. Iran is backing Maliki, essentially, and I think in the end, it is the Iran that's going to get what it wants more than the United States, because Iran is right there. It's in the United States, it's not at this point, and it has very limited asset. The Gulf countries that I think could have renewed their relations with a united Iraq find themselves in a very difficult situation, because it is very difficult to conceive of the Gulf countries developing very good relation with the Shia region, which is dominated by Iran. I mean, they have no interest in doing that, and they are not going to do it. At the same time, the Gulf countries are not, at this point, are not in a position to have much influence in the Sunni region as well, because the Sunni region is not controlled by people the Gulf countries like. In other words, ISIL, it's not what the Gulf countries would like. So that the Gulf countries find themselves in the situation of not having much to say in the Shia parts of it, of Iraq, but not having much to say in the Sunni parts of Iraq. Unless, and that goes back to the whole issue, and I really don't have time to go into this, given the fact that I'm already over my time, it gets tied in with the whole situation in Syria and the policy of the Gulf countries toward Syria. The ones that I think are doing well, with or without without a nuclear agreement, are the Kurds. That at this point, the Kurds have been very good at maintaining good relations with everybody. They have good relations with Iran. In fact, they are building, or at least they have signed agreement. I cannot find information telling me whether they're actually building or not, on 2 pipelines, directly to Iran, one from importing, importing gas and exporting petroleum products, essentially. I don't know whether it's actually being built, but they have signed they have recently signed an agreement. They have this pipeline to Turkey. Turkey is dying to buy gas, oil, but particularly gas from Kurdistan, which turns out to be, they don't have the gas pipeline finished yet. They are working on it, but the gas pipeline would be of great importance to Turkey, which is also very much in need of gas for the generation of electricity. Turkey is not happy with the gas prices they get from Iran, I understand. They think that they can get it for cheaper from Kurdistan, which is developing into a major gas producer for a country that size. So essentially, what we have a very complicated picture that has developed. So that talking about, and I'll leave it here, talking about the impact of an agreement on Iraq as a whole just does not make any sense. What's going to happen next is, as I said, the future is, the new is not yet born, but there is a present which is very much born and which is 3 separate countries, I would say.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to 12:30 or 12? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you for those two very rich discussions. I'm going to just ask you very brief questions because I know the audience has many questions, I'm sure. So I just want to ask you a brief, and I hate it when moderators do this, but I'm going to ask you a yes or no question. But I'm going to offer you a maybe option as well. And we've been talking about this nuclear deal. So, do you think we will see a comprehensive, sustainable nuclear deal by July 20th or, 6 months thereafter?
I can't say anything else.
Yeah.
Not in that form, but I think there will be a deal.
Okay.
Not a comprehensive deal, but there will be a plan for the next 2 years.
Oh, well, feel free to elaborate. I'll allow you to elaborate on that.
I think it will be very difficult to achieve a comprehensive deal with all the different details that need to go into it, especially technical details. But I don't think it will be impossible to achieve a framework for how Iran and the IAEA and the 5+1 countries will collaborate over the next 2 years to take steps on both sides that will lead to that ideal situation at the end. In a way, I think there will be a second interim deal.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. I'm going to do the same to you with my apologies, Marina, but you did telegraph it to some extent. My question is, will Nouri al-Maliki survive?
Maybe. And no, that's a maybe, because it depends essentially on whether Shias rally around him at this point, which they might do. But if he survives, it's very bad for Iraq, because if he survives, his government will not, there is no way a government headed by Maliki can convince the only hope in the north of Iraq is that some of this rather unholy alliance between ISIL, remnants of the Ba'athist, the establishment that are up there, and the tribes will break up if you have a Maliki government. The only hope for that part of the country to get out from under the control of ISIL is if the Iraqi allies break away. And there have been already some skirmishes in certain areas between Ba'athist elements and and ISIL and so on. But if Maliki remains prime minister, I think that alliance will stay together.
Okay, great. So let's take one, please, sir. And then
2 quick questions.
Yeah.
I think you have to wait for the mic.
the microphone, yes. And if you could identify yourself, please.
Dr. Ivan King of King's Counseling and Mediation Services, former professor at George Mason, University of Maryland. John, excellent, excellent presentation. Thank you. I'd like to get a copy of your slides.
Sure.
And Marina, what do you see as any option for the United States becoming involved in Iraq again?
Okay. You want?
Yeah.
You,
Why don't
we
you-
take
why don't you
one at a
take-
time.
We'll take this one,
Okay.
and I'll do two from the overflow room after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you have in mind, but let me try and explain. Is militarily. I'm pretty well. I think we already are sending in some advisors on the ground. I am pretty sure that Obama is not going to send in ground troops, combat troops. I think that's pretty clear. The danger is that, and we probably will do some bombing. I mean, I think we'll get the Air Force involved. That's part of the reason for sending in the advisors, because it's not just advisor, it's also to try to guide possible airstrikes. The problem is that unless those airstrikes are conducted very, very well, we'll end up by having a situation in which the United States is seen as bombing Sunni populations, civilian populations, and that would be extremely bad for the it would be very bad for the Sunni populations, but it would also be very bad for the United States. And that is, I think, the real danger in that situation in terms of U.S. intervention. Politically, I think the United States, we talk a lot, but I don't think we have much influence on the main players. I don't think we have influence on Maliki. We have not had for a long time. I don't think we have any influence on most of the political parties at this point, including the Kurds, who are very sore because the United States was opposed to, and still is opposed to, their exporting oil directly without Baghdad intervention.
Thank you. So I'm going to just take a couple from the overflow room. This one, I think, Bijan, you can address this. Is there any sense that a more independent Iraqi Kurdistan poses a threat to Iran, a country with a significant Kurdish minority? And also, let me just add on to that, do you see any tensions in the Shatt al-Arab waterway between Iran and Iraq?
Okay. First of all, I mean, I agree with Marina, but essentially that there will be three smaller regions or states or whatever you want to call them, but this is definitely not something that Iran wants. Iran has already had, negative experiences with the Caucasus breaking into smaller states, because these will become smaller states that quarrel all the time over different issues, and that is definitely not wanted. So the opposition from Iran is not because of the Iranian Kurdish population, but it's more because of the concept of having three smaller states that could be quarreling all the time and having conflicts. And just look at the last 20 years with the Caucasus, and you see what types of tensions could emerge for Iran. I don't see any, I haven't noticed any tensions over the Shatt al-Arab. There has been some operational issues in Shatt al-Arab because the river needs to be dredged, and both sides have been very slow in having the agreements and actually implementing. They have signed the agreement now, but it has to be dredged so that it can be used, and it's not right now not being used. So once it starts being used, there may be some tensions over, okay, who controls it again. And remember, that was also this whole border in the Shatt al-Arab was one of the key issues, and once it starts to be used, we will have to see how the two sides will behave.
And the threat to Iran with an independent Iraqi Kurdistan?
I don't see that. I think the most interesting transformation in Iran over the past 2 decades, basically since the Iraqi Kurdistan became more autonomous, even under Saddam Hussein, has been the transformation in the Iranian Kurdistan. Now the Iranian Kurds have the best of two worlds. They have their mother country, Iran, but at the same time, whenever they want to go to another type of Kurdistan, they just walk over the border and go to the other side. And if you're a Kurd, you can enter the other side without much documentation and without passport and visas. And as a result of increasing trade, for example, just talk about this oil emergence of oil capacity in the Iraqi Kurdistan. A large segment of that oil is being exported to Iran through tankers, because Iran has obviously population centers in the north and refineries in the north, and has oil in the south. So Kurdish oil is going to Iranian refineries, and Iran frees up oil in the Khark Island for export, which is ideal for the Kurds because they get the money from international buyers, and also ideal for Iran. It doesn't have to ship its own oil north. So because of the increasing trade between the Iraqi Kurdistan and the Iranian Kurdistan, Kurdish traders and the Kurdish population has become a lot more well positioned in Iran. Kurdistan as a province remains underdeveloped, but Kurdish traders and Kurdish trade in an Iranian trade has grown. So I don't think that it's considered as a threat, but what is being seen or perceived as a potential threat is if there is genuinely three competing smaller nations on Iran's borders, that will create tensions for Iran.
Okay, let's go to, I'll take two questions here, please, sir, and then over here.
Ted Benke, a couple of questions. This was actually more for Bijan, talking about Iran as a energy hub. Do you see development of the oil fields at Wasit and Maysan province on the Iraqi side, instead of possibly going south out through the Gulf, now maybe there being some sort of investment in trying to move that oil almost due east into Iran and then back out to their facilities, with less government investment in the port facility in the Shatt al-Arab? And then kind of broadly, this is for both Marina and Bijan, is it possible that the greatest implications in Iraq and with the potential of detente between the U.S. and Iran is that the United States accepts whatever Iran's opinion on the situation is and moves towards supporting that, maybe not directly and openly, but certainly behind the scenes?
Okay, and over here, please, if we can bring the microphone.
Thank you. I understand that Sistani has emphasized that Iraqis, and not just Shias, but all Iraqis, should defend Iraq. And then I think the Sunni Mufti, whose name escapes me right now, has also called for all Iraqis to defend Iraq. Can you speak towards the debates within Iraq over what level of identity should be defended, whether it's sectarian versus national?
Okay, so we have Iran as an energy hub and Iraq, and were you referring to kind of oil swaps or oil moving?
More oil moving directly out of Iran.
Oil moving directly out of Iraq and through Iran. Okay, so oil moving out of Iraq through Iran, and the U.S. accepting Iran's position and supporting it overseas. And then why don't we start with Sistani and his arguments that all Iraqis should defend Iraq?
Yes, he did say that, but the militias that are being called to arms are Shia militias. Maliki would not dare to ask Sunni militias to arms. The Sunni militias are already mobilized, and they are mobilized against him. So de facto, these groups, each population group is defending its own identity. Yes, at the top levels, people are still making the statements about, the inclusive government and so on. In reality, each group is defending itself. So it's...
And Bijan to Iraq, and also just if you want to touch briefly on the fact that the vast majority of Iraq's oil and its reserves and its exports are in southern Iraq and thus far not affected, which is probably why oil markets have not spiked the way we might have expected them to spike. But to the question of Iraqi oil moving through Iran, and if you also want to touch on that subject as well.
First of all, Iran, if you look at how Iran has behaved over the past few years in the sort of expansion of the Iraqi oil sector, I can tell you that Iran is actually very positive about it. Generally, it supports the developments. There are now various Iranian, both prime contractors as well as subcontractors active in the Iraqi oil sector. Iran looks at Iraq, a developed Iraq, as both a national security benefit and also a business opportunity. I always say that Iraq, if you take oil and gas out of the Iranian trade equation, Iraq is the most significant export market for Iran, with a trade volume of now $12 billion. $12 billion of almost entirely Iranian exports to Iraq. I just heard, I attended a meeting with Iranian subcontractors in the water and wastewater sector. I couldn't believe my own ears, but there are now $1 billion of projects of Iranian engineering companies and construction companies in the water and wastewater sectors in Iraq. It's amazing. So that potential, they know that that potential will only emerge if Iraq can produce oil and export oil and get the money back. So Iran looks at it very positively. If there is a proposal from the Iraqi side, they will definitely look at it very favorably. The two sides have also signed an agreement on collaborating in shared fields. I skipped over it, but this is, for example, one of the areas of energy interrelationship. And this is, for example, something that's happening between Qatar and Iran. Credit to the Qataris, they initiated that. They came to Iran and said, if we actually coordinate our efforts in this shared field, we can get a lot more gas out of it, as opposed to two parallel programs that probably undermine each other. And if Iran and Iraq and Iran and other players in the region can do that, they can definitely get more out of their oil and gas affairs. The reaction from the international oil markets, we need to have another session on this, but just in brief, there is so much buffer still in the oil price. And one of the reasons why there is a buffer is because if it drops too far below the sort of $90 mark, then all the unconventional sources in North America don't lose their economic nature. Hence, a desire by all sides, the conventional ones because they get more money, the unconventional ones because they become more economical, to keep the price there. So there is enough buffer that if there is a push up, it goes from 100 to 106, but it doesn't go to 150. But if the crisis continues and it goes into the sort of Iraqi fields, because the fear is not the Iraqi fields, the fear would be Saudi Arabia, because once ISIL gets closer to the Saudi border, and I unfortunately have to say I see that they will penetrate Saudi Arabia, and that is when the world markets will start reacting.
Absolutely. You wanted to add on?
Yeah, I wanted to add concerning the question about Meysan and Wazet and whether they might export directly. I think it's this is more by way of background. Those two provinces plus all other Basra, all the oil provinces in Iraq have been for quite a long time now, quite restive with the government in Baghdad and putting more pressure to be given greater autonomy in controlling oil, their own oil resources. There is, strangely enough, the same people who were very strongly opposed to an autonomous Kurdistan in the past have started talking about a year ago, openly, about maybe we should follow the example of Kurdistan because they control their resources and look at how much better they are doing than the other part of than the rest of Iraq. So it's not impossible that as part of this desire to control their resources autonomously, that these provinces might also try to work out some deals across the border.
Right, please. Any other? Back there, please. If there's another one as well, you can raise it. Okay. Go ahead. Yes, please.
My question is to Mr. Khajepur. With such a prosperous and colorful future that you pictured for the Iranian energy if the sanctions are relieved, why should Iran needs this expensive nuclear program, such a burden on the country and the nation? Why doesn't he cooperate? While the international community have agreed to a rights to a peaceful nuclear program for everybody. I'm from Voice of America, Persian TV.
So
You want
please,
to answer?
Yeah,
Okay.
answer. We don't have another
I
one
thought-
right now, so
okay.
please go ahead. Why the nuclear energy program?
The justification, I can't speak on behalf of the Iranian government, but as an energy expert, I can tell you that it does make sense. Why? Because as I showed you, we live in a region, we live in a world that is going to need more and more energy. And if you have resources that can produce energy, we have oil and we have gas, if you say, imagine you are the decision maker. If you say, well, we have enough gas and enough oil, we don't need any other resources, then you're actually giving up a potential export of your country, because you have customers for oil and you have customers for gas, and you would basically undermine the economic potential of your own country. I always use the example, Norway. Norway produces all its domestic needs with hydro energy. Has anyone told Norway why they are developing their oil and gas? Well, they're developing oil and gas, and they have become one of the wealthiest nations in the world because they developed their oil and gas. They didn't need it domestically, but they created value for their economy. So it does make sense, and we heard from Abdullah as well. Also, the other GCC countries are looking at the potential of nuclear energy because it is a potential. You may disagree about the environmental impact, about the political cost, about economic cost. You should have, I agree, I have written about this myself, you should have a cost-benefit analysis for anything that you plan. But the actual program in itself, from an energy economic point of view, makes sense because it makes more oil and gas available for export in different forms, and that means wealth for your country. So we should not limit it to just what we need, but what we could be, what we could generate in the future. It's like saying, why is Germany producing so many cars? Well, they have enough for their own. Well, they're exporting it, and they generate wealth for their country.
Right, so I'll just, please, over there. And this will be the last question.
I've noticed in this discussion of Iran that there's been no mention of the Ayatollahs at all. And I'm just wondering, has their influence basically disappeared? Are they likely to try to reassert their influence, and what impact could that have?
Which Ayatollahs are you talking about? Because we have Ayatollahs and Ayatollahs. You have to. Khamenei is still the supreme leader of Iran, and he has a lot of power. And he is obviously the leader, the political leader of the country. But when you say Ayatollahs, you can also talk about the religious authorities sitting in Rome who have experienced a period of difficult development with the Ahmadinejad government because there was less and less attention to the type of sort of moral and ideological debates that came from there. But now again, we have a cleric as a president, and obviously there is a lot more, relationship with the clergy. But interestingly, it's very interesting that Rouhani as a cleric is actually taking on some of the more hardline Ayatollahs in Iran and questioning their wisdom and their legitimacy in a way in some of their discussions. This is an interesting debate to watch. But when I say you find Ayatollahs and Ayatollahs, you also find a lot of Ayatollahs who are happy to not interfere in anything political because they feel they undermine their own religious legitimacy by doing so, or social position. So you have all types of things, but the political structure is still the same. We have the Assembly of Experts with 86 clerics. We have the Supreme Leader. We have a lot of presence of the clergy in the political structure.
Now let me just give Marina your last thought, your last word. You painted a grim picture of Iraq, and I think there's a lot of justification for that. And you did say the old is dead and the new has not yet been born. Offer us your thoughts as a 5-year forecast. I mean, do you see us continuing in this vein? Low-level insurgencies. Moving into civil war. And where are we going with this?
Well, look, the best case scenario, I think, that we can expect is that of a federal Iraq with a lot of autonomy for each of the regions. That is certainly what the Kurds are pushing for. The position of Sunnis has been changing because Sunnis were the greatest what do you say, Iraqi nationalists in the past. But their position has been switching little by little. If you look at the statements made by, for example, provincial governors and so on in the last year and a half, what you find even among the Sunnis, this is before ISIL, but that even among Sunnis, there was growing interest in regional autonomy. There were many of the provincial councils in Sunni areas had voted to start the process of transforming the province into a region. This sounds a bit arcane, but a region is a region looking like Kurdistan, that is, with a lot of regional autonomy. Maliki blocked that process. So clearly, even among Sunnis, there was a rethinking of this. We have to keep Iraq together at all costs. Now, it's very difficult to know what the position of Sunnis is now, because for one thing, it is quite possible that ISIL itself is leading to the separation of the Sunni region. Because, as I said before, there is no indication so far that really ISIL so far has not shown an interest to take the war to regions that are not a Sunni-dominated region. Now, is this just is this a tactic first you consolidate your position in the Sunni regions and then take the war elsewhere? I have no way of telling, but I suspect that they may very well stop at that and instead focus on consolidating the Sunni parts of Syria and Iraq and building their Islamic State there, assuming that they remain in control. So I think probably is, and that's why I'm going. At the same time, I think all these regions, including Kurdistan, which is the best place to really become independent, realize that at least for the time being, they would be better off as part of a confederation. That is, if Iraq did not fall apart completely, but stay together. I think that's probably the best case scenario to me. It's not what the United States want. I agree that's not what Iran wants. I don't think either country is particularly well placed to keep it from happening, whether or not we like it. So.
Well, thank you all for attending. Thank you, tip of the hat to the overflow room as well. I know it was crowded. And please join me in thanking our speakers for a very rich discussion.
خب حالا سوالتو از خودت میپرسم. فکر می‌کنی do you think there will be an agreement?
I decided to stick my neck out, but I think somebody said that there is